line.
CRISES.
See, it's a good name. The main line.
What's it called when you get like an experimental dosage?
I know.
Clinical trial.
A clinical trial.
Clinical trial. There you go. Yeah, I think that could work. Actually,
Placebo, nocebo.
Am I wrong in thinking that's just so overrated? People are saying you have to be worried about them. Like, they don't think deeply enough about anything to be like, we're going to renew some like traditionalist movement. He's busy like snorting coke on someone's yacht.
It's almost like the purpose of like the more right-wing kind of theory is like so they don't have to think about it too much. Because it's like if you distill like Ayn Rand's like philosophy, like it's basically a philosophy of just like don't even think about theory, just objective reason, and yeah, and like Ayn Rand.
That was actually pretty explicit in early.
Peterson.
No, I'm saying that was actually very explicitly an injunction in early conservative theory. People like Joseph de Maistre, throughout his work, basically insisted that the biggest problem in society is that too many people were encouraged to question basic presuppositions about the way the world worked. And rather than doing that, they should treat it as you put it, religious dogma, and accept what authority tells them.
I wonder if there's been some kind of slippage between that idea of like don't think critically and crisis, because we know that crisis and critique have the same etymological roots. They both go back to the Greek word krenine, or I don't know how to pronounce it. Krenine, it means to separate in order to make a decision. So we get the word crisis and we get the word critique from the same root.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, so I just started recording now. I don't know if you guys have been recording on your own devices this whole time.
Yeah,
I'm recording.
Okay, my bad. I just started,
like
sorry.
3 minutes in now.
Well, Eric and I have been pumping out the content on the DL.
Oh, yeah?
Systems theory and cybernetics.
Pumping each other on the DL?
Yeah. Secret rendezvous.
Yeah, sorry. Honestly, I already deal with like enough fucking messages all day long. I don't need to I can't just add another one and be like consistent on that. I want to. I try chiming in every now and then, but it's just a fucking huge time sink. You know
Wait, what? You don't even pay attention to our group chat?
Like the Discord?
No, I do go on the Discord, and every now and then I pay attention to it. I'm just saying, I don't pay as much attention to it as I should, because like it's at some point or another, I'm like fucking dealing with like messages just takes up like a healthy chunk of my day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't had much time to go on the Discord lately, but I'm the same kind of.
Yeah, like I got 50 emails.
Have you seen all the art that's up in the Discord now?
Yeah, that photographer dude has like some really nice photos.
Shout out to Ian.
Yeah, those are good.
I think who's the other guy posted some photographs too. They both know their cameras and their stock, and
Ericsson.
I just take pictures on my phone or on my Fujifilm.
Yeah, I remember there's some good ones like right after the election or maybe just before of like protesters. He got some action shots in like DC. I think that was Ian. Those were cool.
Yeah, he's got some pretty ballsy looking shots there too. That's pretty cool. I like it.
No doubt.
Anyway, so I don't know. Are you gonna Pills? Are you gonna like introduce this topic, or what are we doing here? Is this?
Has anyone got
what's happening here?
Anyone gonna set Can anyone set the stage?
I'm feeling like responsibility anxiety. So,
do you want me to do it? I don't know. I mean, fuck.
Hey, why don't you? Let's mix it up.
It was your idea.
There you go. You've been voluntold, Victor.
I've been voluntold. Okay. This is weird. Okay. Yeah, and I'm like clamming up here. I like don't know what to say.
All right. Welcome everybody to the Plastic Pills Podcast, otherwise known as the Pill Pod, where you can hang out with us and microdose on beer. Unless you're Matt. Matt's looks like you got a tonic.
The giant vodka tonic.
A giant tonic.
In a stein.
That is huge.
It is in a beer mug.
So today we're talking about...
If you hear Matt get a little slurry at the end, it's because he's drinking out a stein.
Yeah, and who knows how many shots you put in there.
Well, it was a healthy amount. Let's just put it that way.
He's trying to get through marking, and this is the only way to do it properly.
Yeah.
So I guess I could just say that like this week's unstructured pill pod was inspired, I guess, by something I've been thinking about lately, which is just the category crisis and how it like it's instantiated in theory, how like crisis is kind of invoked as a driver of like, or like a way of defining moments, right? Because I think a lot of critical theory talks about the moment and describes the different phenomena in society, like technological changes, like changes to like social mores, cultures, economics, right? And like oftentimes this is conceptualized among the category or under the category of crisis. And I just think that that's like an interesting thing to dwell on. And in some ways, maybe 20th and 21st century philosophy is, you know, largely been identified as a time of crisis, or it's been described as a time of crisis. Maybe that's not true. I mean, maybe every philosopher has talked about their own time as crisis. I don't know if Kant, was he talking about a crisis at that time? I'm not sure, but that's the basic topic.
And the definition.
You kind of have to look at the meaning of the word, and
that's a good way. That's a good place to start.
Yeah. Does anyone got an engram up of crisis?
I mean, compared to like the crises of capitalism, the boom and bust, falling rate of profit, and all that, Husserl's big issue was like, oh fuck, science is no longer based on transcendental phenomenology. We have a crisis in science.
Yeah, he wrote something called The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Philosophy.
I actually think that's a really interesting book, though, because one of the features that you find in it is this real anxiety that the empirical sciences or the research sciences aren't based on any sufficiently firm philosophical foundation, right?
Yeah, but if you're going to call that a crisis, I mean...
Well, that's what I mean.
They've been doing fine never listening to Husserl.
No, well, that's exactly it, right? I mean... my brother-in-law is in quantum theory, right? He's doing his PhD. You all met him. And from hanging out with a lot of those people, they could not give a rat's ass about the philosophical foundation. Some of them do, as kind of a matter of interest and intellectual curiosity and stuff. But they'd say exactly what Pills just did, right? We're doing fine. Ontological questions, that's nice. But you know what? It's for other people who have time to waste on that kind of stuff. That's their kind of mentality.
Yeah, so I guess what you're identifying there is what, like Husserl's sense of crisis would be what, epistemological crisis, or?
I think Husserl's sense of crisis comes around saying the sciences are no longer meaningful for everyday life, which makes sense with regard to his phenomenological approach. The European sciences and mathematical sciences are becoming purely positivistic.
This was a joke, by the way. He thought this was a crisis, and it's fine. It's fine, Husserl.
Yeah, exactly. No, but I think that that's actually like a revealing joke, because to some extent, like part of what I had in mind when I was thinking about this was I do sometimes think that the category of crisis is like overused by theorists and philosophers. It's like they want to identify more things as a crisis to maybe, make their inquiry seem more grandiose than really it is to some extent, or identify something as like, oh, we're living in these... and I wonder if it's just also related to the broader tendency in human nature to want to feel like we're living in the end times or something, or some significant point in time. There's like some kind of a cognitive bias towards thinking that. So it might be related as well to that.
If you've ever sat on a review board for like a conference, every single submission has the word urgent in it.
Is that true?
We have an urgent need to reconsider the post-liminal spaces,
pressing issues,
the post-liminal topologies of animal-human hybrids in hentai, world-saving shit.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of conferences, maybe remember I sent you that call for papers, like that was about crisis that I just saw. I think it's an interesting topic. I might even submit an abstract for it. It's like a UCLA political theory thing. Maybe I'll post a link to the
tweet
in the chat here. Yeah, I can read it. I'll read some of it. I'm going to post it right now in the chat so you guys can have a look at it. But yeah, it's you thought it was funny.
Man, no, it's like we need to change the world right now, and we're going to do it in this hotel lobby.
Okay.
I should say also, Victor, you probably experienced this as well, that like one of the things that political theorists or political and cultural commentators really do when they don't actually know how or why they want to change something is just by saying it needs to be radical change, right? Radical is basically the substitute word for we don't know how, we don't know why, we're not exactly sure, but it's got to be big and transformative because otherwise it just doesn't seem urgent enough. Yeah.
Or like a radical rethinking of,
there you go.
Radical rethinking. That's another one.
That's in the subtitle of every paper.
Yeah,
a radical reconsideration of the semiological positionality of owning potted plants.
So in any case, I can read some of the. Why don't I start by reading the first paragraph of this call for papers, and we'll see if that stimulates some discussion here. So, okay. It's called, I guess it's just the first annual UCLA graduate conference in political theory. And it's like, the vocabularies of rupture and continuity, often taken to be incompatible, are well known to political theorists. Claims of crisis and catastrophe abound, whether technological, ecological, social, or political. Those attuned to these exigencies increasingly reject incremental change, advocating a forceful transformation of our modes of life, material surroundings, and relationships to each other. Outside academia, nationalists, resurgences challenge the continuity of a globalized world, installing border regimes that rupture the movements of goods and persons. Airwaves and print media fill with constant complaints of polarization, fears that ideological enthusiasm could rupture time-honored political norms. However, vocabularies of rupture can belie an appreciation for the continuities of political life. That's only halfway through the paragraph. I can continue.
I'm done. All the verbosity of any academic writing.
So continuity and rupture. I guess crisis is associated with rupture, and it seems to be positioned as like a discontinuation of our traditional norms and values and ways of doing things. I mean, wouldn't one of the biggest crises, like a crisis of meaning, come from Nietzsche and nihilism and the death of God? That seems to be one of the sort of overarching philosophical crises of the 20th century.
I also wanted to point out the kind of unusual elective affinity between these moments of rupture that are theorized on, particularly by materialist philosophers and theoreticians, and like an older prophetic tradition that you find in many of the monotheistic faiths, right, where there's this idea of divine or messianic intervention. And it's unusual because there's a lot of vocabulary, the sensibility, and the kind of metaphysical connotations are the same. And the only people who I can think of who've theorized on the commonalities between these two vocabularies would be somebody like Walter Benjamin, to a lesser extent, somebody like Alain Badiou right now, where he talks about these kind of Pauline reactions to events and so on and so forth.
Yeah. I think, it's maybe worth quickly the second paragraph of this call for papers, like kind of giving their main message. They're like, we seek to rethink the assumed antithesis of rupture and continuity. As the question below suggests, continuity and rupture are mutually generative in some cases, while in others they're transposable at specific sites with a neatness that should make us question their relation. So I guess like the whole idea is maybe rethink, and again, maybe a radical rethinking of the dichotomy between those two things.
And just to take a step back, how many real crises have there been that we needed academics to come help us rethink?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it makes me think a little bit of, COVID obviously is a little bit of a crisis, and it makes me think back to the Agamben episode, right? Yeah. Where in some ways, a theory, a certain theoretical apparatus, a certain theoretical arms by Agamben are used, and he wants to put them onto the current crisis and describe them on those terms. Mm-hmm. And it seems like his theoretical arsenal is kind of designed to talk about forms of crisis, right? Like states of exception.
Yeah.
But I think in that case, I don't know if we all came to an agreement, at least, but my takeaway from it was that he was a little bit hasty there, rather than looking at what was happening. He wanted to describe it with his particular theory crisis arsenal.
Well, we got to sell books, right?
Yeah.
I mean, everything's a crisis. Feminists, they're a crisis because they're trying to emasculate Western men.
A crisis of masculinity.
Right. Another one.
I mean, everyone goes through crises in their life. Yeah. Everyone goes through the midlife crisis and the identity crisis. There's personal crisis, and there's also more broad, like social crisis and ecological crisis. It's not like crisis is something really rare. It seems like it's something that's always around. And the deep meaning of the term really, like etymologically, it means like a point of decision, like a point you come to where a crucial decision needs to be made, like a turning point or a crossroads. And that seems to be like almost like neoliberal society wants to deny that there's ever a crisis, that like business as usual, right? Even this COVID, you see posters around saying like, let's get back to the old normal. Let's get back to business as usual, right? Like this crisis is just it's just a blip. It's just a hiccup. Nothing's really going to change. It's all a sort of show and an illusion. And we just need to get back to normal, which is something we should not want. We should not want to get back to the old normal, or at least most of what went along with it, because the old normal sucked. This new normal sucks, but the old normal sucked too.
We need a radical.
How about
rethinking.
a third option? How about a third option?
Kierkegaard, I think, expressed this really well, and I'll draw on like Zizek's interpretation of him, where he made exactly the point that you're making, right? Which is that in one's personal life, right, the thing about crisis is that it reveals your freedom to you, right? Because most of us, tend to like to fall into bad faith presuppositions that everything that we're doing is determined by forces that are beyond our control, right? Well, I can't really get ahead because, my job. I can't really get ahead because I'm not making enough money. I can't get ahead because, my wife and my boyfriend suck or whatever it happens to be. And when you find yourself in a crisis, it's something where you realize that you do actually have the freedom to act, right? You have the freedom to act by getting rid of all of those things or by trying to rejuvenate them in a certain way. And a lot of people are afraid and they run away from it, right? And Zizek makes exactly the same point when it comes to social phenomena in the way that Eric was just describing, right? A lot of the times, ideology tends to insist that there's a necessitarian logic that underpins everything, which means that the world has to stay exactly the way that it is. And it's only in moments of crisis that we realize that actually everything is contingent and up for grabs, and we can remake the world if we so desire. And we don't have to accept the kind of, in this case, neoliberal injunction that there is no alternative to the system the way it is, which is precisely why the kind of ideological gesture that you see in times of crisis is to try to deny that it is a crisis. To suggest that it can be managed using the conceptual and institutional tools that are available.
Well, now that we're getting serious, I'd like to reiterate my position that if anyone is trying to sell you their books or get hired to sell books and they're talking about a crisis, you can probably dismiss that as artificially generated. The entire news media apparatus, all the pundits, academia, or at least humanities academia as a whole, anytime they say it's a crisis, they're probably trying to sell you something. But
so is
if
there
you
a
want to talk
crisis
about...
is there a crisis of like rhetorical hyperbole or something like that?
Yeah, I would say so. We need to radically rethink rhetorical hyperbole in the academy.
Crisis of rhetoric.
Well, it's funny though, I feel like we all fall into this so much. It's hard not to, and it's kind of interesting to think about like someone like Steven Pinker, who I really don't like very much, but it is telling. Maybe did I bring this up in like a previous episode? But it's related to this too. That like, we're so attached to it that like other academics, when Pinker tries to write a book about how things are actually better and that we're not in a crisis and that things are getting better, like people were angry at him. Like people like hated him for saying that like things are getting better because like we're so attached to like this discourse of crisis. Now, don't get me wrong. I do not agree with Pinker that much. I think he's missing a lot, but it's still kind of funny to me the way there's like a visceral reaction to like an anti-crisis discourse.
Yeah, I mean, those arguments, like things are getting better, like they're a little bit shitty, I think. I mean, what other, like, obviously there's, throughout history, people have had trouble feeding themselves. But, like, what business do we have in the 21st century with so much of the planet being in abject poverty and struggling to meet their caloric requirements so they don't develop nutritional deficiencies and developmental issues? Like, those sorts of things have no business being in the 21st century, never mind the 20th century. Yet we allow these things to persist in the name of denying that any important decisions can be made. There's no crisis. Don't worry. The system, whatever you think of it, the free market or your your planned economy or whatever the system is that you're embedded in will take care of things. You don't have to worry. Keep calm and carry on. Right? That's the message that the so-called political elite want to send, so that not too many people start to participate in this decision-making process that we, as purveyors of crisis and catastrophe, are trying to work people up into participating in.
I'm in complete agreement with Eric, particularly about the anti-neoliberal stuff, right? I think I say more power to it, right? I do think that Victor raises an interesting point here, though, which is that rhetorically and aesthetically, and I'll just leave it at that, right? I can't actually think of any academic book I've ever read that offers, shall we say, a positive appraisal of things as they are. You know what I mean? There's no academic book I've ever read that's like looking at the data, looking at the situation, or reviewing society as it stands right now. Things are moving pretty well. A few a little tinkering around the edges will be fine. Really, the only book of critical theory I can think of that adopts even a moderately positive appraisal of things is Baudrillard's kind of ecstatic embrace of hyper-reality, right? And that's almost defeatist, where he says, we have no choice. This is the world we live in right now, so we might as well just all sit there and enjoy the toboggan ride, go moving downhill.
I'm going to need a citation for that.
This was particularly in his 1990s work when he was talking about Disneyland and stuff. He was just
but he's never positive. He's just bemoaning it, just saying that.
But this is what I'm saying. It's the closest that I've ever seen a book come where he's just there's really no fighting this any longer, so we might as well just embrace it to the extent that
it's that Nietzschean affirmation, right? Fuck the loss of meaning. We just need to affirmatively embrace life.
Apparently, Baudrillard went to Disney. Sorry.
Wasn't Rorty who also advises people to adopt this ironic attitude or something because things are, I don't know, it reminds me what you're saying to what Rorty says about that.
Exactly. Apparently Baudrillard was taken to Disneyland and he was shown Euro Disneyland, basically, where there's a little village where all the different European communities are represented in this extremely hyper real and stereotyped way. And people were looking at him basically being isn't this awful? And he was no, it's great. You know what I mean? Normally I'd have to get on a train to go to Belgium. Or I'd have to get in a flight and go to Greece, and now I can just walk through the whole continent. It's all readily available to me. The food is better and cheaper, and they select, the best things from each culture. What's not to like about Disneyland, right?
I love the image of this old French intellectual on some kind of princess teacup ride with his arms crossed, just looking around fuck this place.
Smoking, yeah,
He said the horror of Disneyland was the parking lot because you believe you can go home from it.
yeah, it's fun.
So I was thinking also there's a, one of the more, pervasive, or especially, I guess, when postmodernism was kind of becoming in vogue in the 90s, and, still people talk about this, crisis of meaning, right? I think that's maybe the overarching, crisis discourse that is often talked about, I guess, especially in political theory circles. But I'm reminded of sort of a feminist challenge to that whole discourse, especially in the postmodernism. I'm reminded by my professor, Geraldine Finn, in my undergrad. I remember she used to raise, the observation and sort of from the feminist perspective challenge of those discourses, that it's here we are, 20th century, and we have all these men, bemoaning all this crisis of meaning and how every my rootedness is dissolving underneath me. And I guess her question was always well, crisis for who, right? It's whose crisis is this? And I think that in general, that's an important question to ask, which is just when you make these grand sweeping statements, as she would say, these men like to make these grand sweeping statements about things, right? And it's well, who are we talking about? Who's the people experiencing this crisis of meaning, right? It's and her argument would be well, it's mostly these men who are sad about, I don't know, all these things changing. And of course, at the same time, you're seeing women get all these increased rights and participation in the society.
Yeah, Star Wars roles. I don't get it.
Sure.
Exactly what I
anyway,
that's exactly what I heard, Victor. I heard that exact thing. If you search, go search Claire Colebrook and Carrie Wolf talking about the Anthropocene, they talk about that as a crisis too, and they bring up the exact same thing, a crisis for whom? For whom is it a crisis?
Exactly. I think that's a key question when we have these discourses.
Yeah, just to go riff off of that, to talk about another kind of Nietzschean embrace of nihilism, right? A feminist theorist that I really tend to like and admire is someone like Donna Haraway, right? And her Cyborg Manifesto, where one of the points she says is that, like, why would you want to live in a universe that's saturated with meaning, right? A universe saturated with meaning is an Aristotelian universe where you have a purpose that you're meant to fulfill, and you have to fulfill it, and you have no choice, right? What we have right now is a meaningless universe where you can recreate yourself as absolutely anything that you want to be, right? Which is why at the end of her book, she says, the problem with feminism is precisely that it opens up these possibilities, and the future is therefore cybernetic, right? The recreation of the self by someone who doesn't know what their self is. And she closes her book by saying, I'd rather be a cyborg than a god, because a god still lives in this Aristotelian universe and has his or her role to play, whereas a cyborg is a definite potential into a sweeping future.
Oh, I like that. Are you trying to get me a little aroused there? I feel it.
Oh, always. I was fucking like practically, directing that just at you, baby.
Have that highlighted
more
book.
Homoeroticism.
You had that page bookmarked with a condom, didn't you?
I did, yeah. And, there's a little like Eric Tate with love parts around it. Don't you worry.
So wait. So do you think is Haraway maybe an example of a more optimistic critical theory? I mean, if you even call it a critical theory.
This is what I'm getting at, and this is why I sometimes like her, right? Because a lot of the stuff that I imbibe is about this crisis of meaning, like you, Victor, right? It's like, we live in a nihilistic, we live in a pessimistic era, and this is all terrible, and so on and so forth. And what she gets at, kind of from a feminist angle, but like a post-humanist feminist angle, is like, what's really wrong, with this crisis of meaning, right? I mean, first off, women never felt tremendous amounts of meaning in their life, relegated as they were to second or third class citizens and their sole job being essentially to live and act for someone else, right? So that's a big thing that they bring up. But she says, on the more general point, right, we now entered into a cybernetic era where we can recreate ourselves as these kind of Promethean subjects, if you will. And isn't that exciting, right? And she says, think about Greek myth, right? In Greek myth, essentially Prometheus dared to challenge this Aristotelian universe by bringing fire to man, or humankind, I should say, right? And the gods punished him for it and reascribed the teleological order of being, right? And said, then chained him up on the rock. And she says, now, we've unleashed him again, right? And this is kind of horrifying in some ways, but it's also extremely exciting and creative in a certain manner, right?
Do you feel excited and creative?
I do. I mean, at points, I think that it's kind of interesting.
I do.
Right?
Like,
I mean, sometimes
in between bouts of depression, though, of course.
Yeah, sure.
I don't get depressed. I don't get depressed. Sorry.
Mr. Iron
I mean,
Mind.
not seriously, not seriously depressed, really, much at all. Unless it's always directed at something. Like if there's something concretely shitty going on in my life. But,
Victor's got like Simon and Garfunkel on loop, being like, "I am a rock, I am an island."
You mean you don't feel like the Heidegger's mood of angst behind your world of appearances?
No.
Not
really.
You fall asleep as soon as your head hits the pillow every night.
No, but not because I'm anxious, just because like I'm like thinking about shit, but not angsty shit, just like other shit. But yeah, of course, I mean, maybe I'll have like a moment of existential angst like, every now and again, but it doesn't weigh on me much. I did want to pick up on one other thing that Matt was saying, just like it is interesting to think about when
God killed him.
Yeah.
Victor is dead.
What happened?
Oh, there you're back. Sorry. You can continue.
God took
there
his
we go.
revenge on you.
Oh, I had in there's that one of those intermittent failures. Hopefully it doesn't come back. But okay, you guys are hearing me now?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So what I was going to say, I want to pick up on what Matt was saying a little bit, just the question of what is a crisis of meaning specifically. And I think like when you were talking about Haraway, you bring up a good point in general, which is like, what does it mean to have a meaning, like not in crisis? And I think it's, meaning is like some other like overarching meaning structures that tell us what to do in a way. It's in some ways like meaning is like, I want someone else or some other force to tell me what I should be doing. And it's like, now that I don't have that, I feel in crisis. And it's kind of, I think it's worth dwelling on just like, because when you say crisis of meaning, it feels like more grandiose, but really it's like I'm angsty and sad because I don't have anything telling me what I should do. And it's like, I think it's more grounded to talk about it in that way. I just cut out again, didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
A little bit.
We got the recording. So
okay.
So wait though. Listen to like this is bouncing off of Charles Taylor's secular age argument, you would feel like you were being told what to do, but that's because you're post-crisis, you're post-secular already. But do you think that like a 17th century, I don't know, shoemaker, just a nice chill job, do you think that he thinks God is telling him what to do, or do you think he just feels like he's fulfilling God's purpose in his world? Maybe God's looking out for him while he makes his shoes, and he's kind of chill in that, in the way that a post-Nietzschean subject with the weight of the cosmos placed on his shoulders to create his own apparatus for meaning wouldn't feel that way.
I want to interject on this because the new book that I'm writing with Other Victor, for the introduction, touches on this thing. Litvic, our frequent collaborator, right? Because one of the things that I think a lot of conservative critics of postmodernity and our kind of hyper-real universe miss is the fact that a lot of the roots of our modern crisis of meaning can be found in the Christian tradition, right? And this is something, again, I think that people like Zizek or even like other canny Christian theologians like Paul Tillich picked up on, right? Because what you see with Christianity is a really interesting phenomena where the central figure in the tradition is a God who comes to doubt himself on the cross, right? And then dies, right? And symbolically, one way that can be interpreted is, of course, that God is saying, I'm passing away from this existence and I'm giving you the authority to remake my creation as you see fit, right? And this is the way, Zizek interprets it. It's the way that people like Paul Tillich occasionally interpret it.
That isn't what happened in the Bible.
Well, no, it does actually, because what ends up happening...
I mean, this isn't what my Austrian shoemaker believes.
Of course not. But again, this is one of the points that I think people like Tillich and Zizek are trying to bring up, right? Is that it's important not to let Christianity off the hook for its own role in generating this crisis of meaning, because it had a profound impact on what we might broadly call European civilization as a whole. So when conservative critics now bemoan the fall of Christianity, it's important to recognize in a dialectical manner that Christianity had the inner potential to wind itself down towards something like the death of God. Right? That's not a break. It's, in some senses, a contingent, but nonetheless possible route that the Christian tradition could have taken. And there are resources within the Bible that you can look to which show why this would have happened. Right? The most obvious one, again, being the fact that Jesus died, said, God, why have you forsaken me? Then he ascends into heaven and says, well, it's now up to you. You deal with it. You know what I mean?
My sense of it would be something more like Christianity created the first singular polar hinge for meaning. Everything that is meaningful comes from God. Anything that doesn't come from God is not meaningful. Whereas any other system, had it collapsed, it's multipolar in terms of its meaning, or syncretic, or whatever. So I wouldn't take the death of God sense that you have, because I don't know that sense of loss would have been widespread, but I definitely think that Christianity absorbing all meaning unto itself, at least in the Western world, and then, killing God, that would be much more responsible for a sense of homelessness.
Yeah, very fair.
Yeah.
What I'm just trying to say, and I'll let fix it as soon as it's done, is that it's important not to let Christian conservatives off the hook because they always want to say that, well, what we see now is a break with Christian tradition, in the sense of an ordered Aristotelian universe. And we need to say, no, if Christianity is foundational to the Western way of thinking about things, then Christianity must have played a foundational role in generating the conditions that we see right now. There must have been inner potentials within Christian doctrine that led to this point. And I think you can see that with some of these new interpretations by materialist critics of Christianity, right? Where they say, look, God literally dies in the Christian tradition in every single one of the Gospels, and doesn't just die. He sits there and says, why have you forsaken me, O Lord, right? He comes to doubt himself. And I think it's important to recognize this rather than give into this reactionary predisposition to see everything as some kind of big fall away from a sacrosanct Christian period.
I also think that discourses of crisis in academia maybe overvalue or overestimate how much that shoemaker would actually care about like these thick meaning structures. Like it's really the theoreticians and like, you know, the priests or whatever who are really worried about this thick meaning loss. It's like that guy just wants to feel like he's got like family and friends around and just wants to continue making his shoes in a way that like he can, but he doesn't care about like the underlying meaning, like structures, you know, like he doesn't have like a strict sense of like a theoretical understanding. It's just like, you know, I get to live my life comfortably. And I think maybe like the theorists project their concern with like, you know, oh, like if things can't be justified metaphysically, then it's like, oh, it's going to be a disaster for these everyday people. It's
the
like
sciences are going to collapse because they're not based
exactly.
on transcendental phenomenology.
Little anti-theory there.
Yeah. No, I remember though, there was some Max Weber scholar that I read who put it really nicely with reference to your shoemaker pills, where he said, look, you know, say you have Franz and he grew up in southern Bavaria, right? And his father was a blacksmith, and his father was a blacksmith before that, and blah, 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 right? And he was going to marry Elsa, you know, in, you know, the Black Forest, and it was going to be wonderful and all this stuff. But all of a sudden, late 19th century, he's told, listen, there's no more need for blacksmiths any longer. So you're going to need to move to a big city like Munich to get a job in the factory, right? So he leaves the town where he's lived his entire life, and he wanders into Munich, and then he finds that not only are there not just millions of Germans that he's competing with, but French people are there, Italians are there, all kinds of businessmen from the United States even might happen to be jostling around there. They speak many languages. They're not particularly interested in the kind of Roman Catholicism of his birth. He's expected to compete for jobs in industry where the actual owner of the business might change on a decadal basis, right? He really feels adrift in the world in a way that his father and his father's father might not have, right? And I think we can all appreciate some of this. And, you know, to Victor's point, I think this is one of the problems with this notion of restoring a sense of meaning through community, right? I think it's really difficult to do that under the conditions of late capitalist modernity, precisely because there are so many material practices that kind of compel people to engage in alienating activities right now. So that's the one concession to like the kind of crisis literature that I am sometimes willing to make. Right?
I agree.
Also, to Victor's point, though, is that meaning, in a sense, was guaranteed for this shoemaker. Right. They didn't have to think about it quite so much because you're in a society where there's a great chain of being, and you have, I don't know, a monarch, someone at the top. And that's the person, like, meaning flows downwards, right? From God to the monarch, throughout society, from the head to the body to the parts. And you don't have to think too much about it. But in our 20th century, 21st century world, where meaning is no longer guaranteed, where a lot of people now take the stance that we live in an essentially meaningless universe, or in a universe where we're looking at it like as in existence precedes essence, and that we now have to sort of make our own meaning. And people turn to different ways. They turn to existential philosophy. They turn to New Age spiritualism. They turn to
or
Eastern
capitalism.
yeah, sure. They just throw themselves into capitalism. They turn to Eastern wisdom and other sorts of ancient traditions and mysticism.
Mindfulness.
Yeah, and mindfulness and meditation. Like, people seek sources of meaning everywhere now. And,
it sounds like you're summarizing my YouTube channel.
No, but you're right. I mean, you're right. I couldn't agree with you more, Eric. I think that's exactly right. But it does speak back to something I said earlier, which is like, so it does seem like meaning is just someone above you telling you what you should be doing, or like it's like you, the king, and like there's meaning is guaranteed. It's because you know your role.
Yeah, you'd be you part of like a little parish community, and your priest would probably tell you like what the meaningful thing, like what you need to pursue in your life to be a good person, and otherwise you don't need to think too much about your soul and your salvation. Like, meaning, in a sense, is woven into that sort of spiritual, evangelical or Christian kind of structure that you're embedded in. Whereas today, it's not so much. We're in like a marketplace of ideas and meanings, right? Where you know, you can get yoga is disembedded from the Hindu tradition and flown over to California, where where hippies practice it while they're distributing magical stones that you can put under your pillow and all kinds of weird shit that people believe.
I mean, you can just call it LSD, Eric. I mean,
And conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory is a source of meaning for plenty of people, as is all the other kinds of crazy ideologies out there as well. So we have to think intensely about where we get our meaning, or meaning will find us. In a sense.
It sounds a lot like the literal meaning or whatever of the word, of just like having to make the decision, like having to decide yourself. So like it is a crisis, I suppose, in that sense, because people have to decide for themselves.
Yeah, and there's a reason why we focus on rupture and discontinuity and crisis, is because those are places where we can go in as a community and exercise creativity and perhaps put things on a new track that's different than before. And as we'd all hope, better than before, and not simply business as usual as it was before.
Yeah, I should say, I also think this is probably why people like Daddy are so popular right now, right? I mean, he kind of like synthesizes a lot of this together and provides you with a little taste of all of it from across the globe.
He gives you a map of meaning.
He does.
Maps of meaning,
including the authoritarian structure with 12 rules, and now 12 more rules published by his daughter while he's under duress.
Beyond chaos.
Oh God!
I am wondering whether or not that signifies, though, that he's going to try to like offer some concession to the political left, though, because like an antidote to chaos, suggests that he's trying to look for like a more orderly universe of the type that we've been kind of softly criticizing and stuff. A beyond order suggests that maybe he's now like offering some concessions to chaos, or however it is that he frames it. So
yeah, I mean he's right to focus on myth. Like that's also a important locus of meaning that we focus on in critical theory and political debates. Mythical level.
My feeling about this is not so much that it's the authoritarian that we crave necessarily, but more what comes along with myth, which is the community that believes in the myth, perpetuates it, develops it, tells new stories. And, when the market takes over almost every social relation that we have, except for like very minor communities. Otherwise, everything is just a market relationship.
Right.
So there's no incentive to have relationships with people that aren't going to, I guess, benefit you financially. And there's no one there to create that community in place. And I'm not saying it was any different before. It was just there was only one community to join.
Yeah.
Or two.
No, I agree.
The Masons and the church.
Well, and there was community available, but I also think, to some extent, like I'd almost take it a slight step further and say like the myths aren't what matter at all. Like the content of it, it's just like, I see those things as just a vehicle for humans to have a connection with each other. And I think that when humans have connection, they feel better. And myth and like shared things, it's just a way of sharing. It's a vehicle. It could be anything. It's like, we just need something to get us to connect with each other. And like, I don't think the content really matters that much. That's why there's so many different religions in the world. Like the content doesn't really matter. It's just like a vehicle for people to hang out and feel connected to each other and feel like they belong. And
I would go even further than that. I mean, if you look at like what's happened since the 1960s, right? People now become connected around postmodern mythologies, right? Comic book films, sci-fi films, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, like all these little micro communities that kind of assemble themselves over what are essentially bricolages of the mythic poetry, traditions past, right? And I can kind of understand why. I mean, I'm a fan of a lot of these franchises myself, so I'm speaking from place of knowledge,
absolutely.
Right? But
like subcultures in music, right? Yeah, exactly.
But like, I mean, just to kind of touch on what like a lot of people are saying here, right? Like, I do agree with like all what Eric is saying, what Hills is saying, right? That essentially, like, the problem is that there can be a temptation to move towards authority figures in order to provide this sense of meaning, along with the associated hierarchical structures that you would think of when it comes to authority, right? And I think one of the reasons why it is that so many reactionaries feel that there's a crisis of meaning right now isn't because there's actually less meaning in people's lives. So that might be the case for some privileged groups, who kind of vest their identity in a sense of significance in having power and authority, right? It's that sources of meaning have been democratized in a way that they never have before. And associated with this is the need to kind of create new individuated senses of what's significant from groups whose voices we've never really heard before, right? which is precisely why I think that we're in a Promethean age. And what I just really hope is that this is going to be carried out, and it's going to be a project that's going to be undertaken democratically rather than through the auspices of what's fundamentally a very inegalitarian market. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also the fact that you have to make a choice and figure it out for yourself is like why the more conservative types are, there is a temptation towards the authoritarian figure, because it's like, it's the very fact of it being democratized. It's the fact of it being that there might not be a right answer, that other people, like just knowing that other people are making different choices to build their meaning around is like disturbing to like the conservative mindset, where like the very thing that secures their sense of meaning was like, oh, like I'm on the right path that is like objectively right. And it's like losing the possibility of it actually being objective, I think which makes people tempted towards the authoritarian figure, I think.
Well, instead of acting like we're outside of this, why don't we do a little bit of dialectics here and say us hanging out, and the listeners that listen to us, and the people that support us, we're just offering a community based on a myth. And a lot of the time we get stuck in these questions like, what are we doing? What are our politics for? Where are they going? Maybe we're just making a community to hang out, and we just think that our myths are better than all the other ones.
Yeah, I feel that. I mean, I think that's maybe one of the most like satisfying things about how this has been unfolding, this podcast and your YouTube channel, Pills, it's true. It's like meeting people, and like it's made the pandemic maybe feel a little bit less isolating, is the fact that we get to do this every week. So yeah, I mean, I agree.
It gives it a little more purpose, and purpose is a source of meaning, right? That's the whole thing about the midlife crisis is like, what have I been doing with my life? What am I
working in a cubicle for 30 years?
Yeah, what have I been doing? Like my life has been meaningless thus far. I need a cause. I need to commit myself to something in order to feel like I'm doing something meaningful with my life, right? I need to help people. I need to write great books. I need to, I don't know, feed the hungry. I need to make the world a better place in some meaningful way. That seems like, if you're doing like a I don't know if it qualifies as phenomenology, but like everyone has these questions, right? And you find your own source of meaning, and it can seem arbitrary, like where you might choose, if you go into New Age spiritualism, or you go into politics, or if you go into some kind of humanitarian thing. But I think if we take also like a historical perspective, then it doesn't appear quite so arbitrary, because things have been going in certain directions for quite a long time. And modernity is a notoriously difficult place to find meaning in, right? Especially when you think about the rates of mental illness and suicide in developed countries as opposed to other countries. It's a difficult time. Well, but I would also like to hear of a time where someone didn't go through a crisis. Like when has anyone ever had a whole generation that didn't experience any crisis, any kind of anxiety over meaning, or
yeah, that never happened.
Yeah,
I think
it's always been.
If Marx is right, then I think we'd be remiss not to at least bring up the fact that market relationships being like the highest and some cases only form of relationships is a little bit different from what would have been preceding that. Because, all that is solid melts into air. All that is sacred is profaned. If you can believe in anything, it's ironic, because market relationships define almost every relationship, like outside of the family, pretty much.
Yeah. But I also wanted just to add on to Eric's comment in a more humble way, because I think he's exactly right about this, and say that I come back to my point about subcommunities, right? Which is I watched a movie recently called Paul, which is a Seth Rogen film about a little alien and two nerds who decide to quest from the United Kingdom to California in order to go to what's basically a Star Trek convention, right? And what struck me about this movie is these guys are basically losers by any kind of conventional metric, right? But the movie has a lot of sympathy for them. And the reason I liked it is, again, there's this real democratic ethos to the film, which is that they find meaning in this community that they're a part of. That might be kind of vulgar and not particularly sophisticated, but nonetheless, it makes them happy. You know what I mean? And I think that you're starting to see this more and more in the kind of, even the pop art of the time. It's reflecting this desire to move on to a more democratic approach to systems of meaning that don't elevate certain sources of inspiration over others, right? And I think there are problems with that, but I also think it's a liberatory kind of development that's expressed in the kind of cultural materials of the time.
Yeah, I think you're right. And those sorts of subcultures that people get involved in are not only a source of meaning, but closely related is to this quest for meaning is identity, right? And everybody searches for an identity. Yeah. Everyone joins communities and subcultures in order to feel like they have some place they belong, and they derive a sense of self from that, right? So perhaps all of this hubbub over identity politics and the ways that people try to articulate themselves in what's basically some kind of public discourse is part of this search for meaning in the 20th century and coming into the 21st. And it's something we shouldn't dismiss anyway, even though they appear in weird, strange ways and subcultures on the internet and cosplay and comic book conventions, and we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss these sorts of new forms of new ways of being people are adopting. Because I actually find most of that stuff pretty cool. I love video games. Yeah, and I love comics and movies and all kinds. I'm a nerd of the sort too. So I enjoy that stuff, and I like it when I can see people having the freedom to choose. And I know that freedom can also have the opposite effect of a kind of overwhelming, right? Like we call it like paralysis through choice, too much choice, but I generally think it's a good way because normally you get your identity from your family and who came before you, right? Our old Austrian shoemaker is probably a shoemaker because the father was a shoemaker, and it's some kind of and their last name is probably Shoemaker. Let's call him Mr. Austrian Shoemaker. That's probably his last name too, and that's where your identity comes from, and that's where and identity is kind of the bedrock in which you found meaning in.
Well, he's Austrian, so it's Schumacher, right?
Schumacher. Yeah.
All right, so we've been rosy. Oh, the internet's such a beautiful place. Why don't we look at the dark side of our, what do you call it? When reprobates can gather at the same time as the rest of us are making nice furry communities.
I know, that's the other problem.
Because that's the exact flip side of the coin is you can create meaning around any sort of fabricated artificial history that you want. And if you're going to do that, then you might as well say like, we have a problem with the immigrants, and that's the problem.
Yeah, if all things are equal, then how do you evaluate different sources of meaning and different kinds of identities? You can't really do that because you have to kind of say they're all equal and they're all legit in a certain way.
I've said this before. I have so much respect for these Q people, though. Like the creativity that they have, sort of as a group, this emergent mythology. It's the newest, most interesting thing that we've seen in decades.
Oh, you mean the QAnon people?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's beautiful in a way, but it's also a little scary. It's like people taking like Lovecraft seriously, like he wrote nonfiction.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I think that's exactly the problem that we find ourselves in right now, right? Which is that on the one hand, as modern and postmodern subjects, right, there's something nice about this democratization of meaning that's occurring, and the fact that people can now create their individuated selves and communities without interference by, micromanaging hierarchies that tend to presume what the best kind of life will be. And the problem is that not all sources of meaning may be created equal, right? And I'm not actually sure what the answer to that question is, right? Because on the one hand, I don't want to sit there and reprimand somebody who finds a lot of meaning in being, to Eric's point, a video game fan and finds a lot of meaning in that community, right? Or a Star Wars fan. I do want to sit there, though, and reprimand people who find a lot of meaning in being white nationalists or being right-wing populist or whatever it happens to be, right? It's just unclear to me what the standard should be.
Yeah, I mean, we learn well the lesson from postmodernism that there's no sort of objective standpoint you can take on these sorts of issues. There's no objective basis, so it's not something you can quantify.
Yeah, exactly.
Isn't there also at play here, like, you know, this, like, I think what some people crave is like a thicker meaning structure, and then there are some that are more like content with, like, you know, spreading their meaning across things that feel pluralistic. Like, I don't know, like, I think part of the thing that made older meaning structures, like, I don't know, in the Middle Ages, appealing, and, like, you know, when I read someone like Patrick Deneen talking about the breakdown of, you know, family values, like, you know, or like a sexual revolution and all these like things, you know, to me, that's just code word for saying, like, for me to feel like I have thick meaning, it needs to be premised on some kind of exclusion, because the thing that makes this thing meaningful is that we are this group that are tied, and people who don't want to accept that should fuck off somewhere else and be excluded. And I think that that's, like, you know, a thick meaning structure to me is premised on some form of exclusion, and saying, like, there are boundaries, clear boundaries between, like, what is part of this and what is not.
That's probably... Sorry, I can't see when you're talking because your video's off.
I know.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, if we have like a multipolar world also, kind of what I was describing, like if you have a monopolar, God is the source of meaning, and now what you feel like is the source of meaning, then what makes your meaning special in a world like that would be that somebody else doesn't have it, or couldn't have it, or can't have it, or you can stop them from having it.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, and in a way, you could only experience a crisis of meaning when you're in a situation of this thickness of meaning, right? And I guess what I mean by thick meaning, you could think about, like, if your grandparents die and you're inheriting their objects, and maybe something's like a family heirloom, right? Like, that thing has thick meaning to it because it's got a story. It's got a what's the word? It's been passed down over the generations, and it's sort of acquired this meaning that's nowhere visible, as opposed to like a thin version of meaning, which would almost be like a linguistic or a semiological kind of conception of meaning, where just, you know, this means this, and that's all there is to it.
But you call it the death of an aura.
I would actually like to riff off of Victor's point for a second, because I absolutely agree that there are all kinds of different groups out there right now, and, you know, we've talked about them, who tend to feel that meaning has to be inherently exclusionary, and that I can't have a sense of meaning if there are people who essentially don't adopt my sense of values in the community that I happen to inhabit, right? And the way that I've always responded to this is, it's kind of ironic, since a lot of these people also tend to characterize our age as inherently nihilistic, precisely because it is so permissive, so inclusive, and so on. But I would actually turn the tables on them and say that the most nihilistic people that I know are reactionaries, right? Exclusionary reactionaries, precisely because they see the source of meaning in existence as being so thin and so fragile that the presence of any kind of impure or non-involved part of it would destroy the whole structure of significance on which they depend.
Yeah, like Star Wars. We can't let those girls into Star Wars.
Yeah, exactly. The minute, you know, a single woman is going to play Rey in the Star Wars franchise, it just destroys all the significance this franchise has.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and, video games, women getting more involved in video games.
I mean, I don't know why you defend Star Wars in the first place. They're all shit.
Whoa.
That's not true. Oh, there are a few good films in it.
Take a chill pill, buddy.
Yeah. Let's not sit there and insult Star Wars. But, like, you know, the thing is, like, these reactionaries have this extremely nihilistic attitude towards the world, which is, like, basically, if there's anything in here that detracts from my ability to enjoy this with just the people that I want in just the way that I desire, with people who think exactly like me, the whole structure of signification will fall apart. Right? And I think one of the things that we should try to do, exactly as Nietzsche would teach in his Better Moments, is say, you need to toughen up and realize that we live in a pluralistic universe now where people are going to have different sources of a meaning. And rather than react viscerally against that, like some kind of weak nihilist, you should embrace it as a feature of the experimentation in what it means to be human and the kind of sources of meaning we can create.
Yeah,
right?
and I think the sorts of anti-immigration libertarian types are one of those exclusionary groups you were talking about, because they feel maybe that immigrants aren't going to invest meaning in the things that they invest meaning in the same way, right? Because that's essentially what we do in our lives when we're going about our days and we're thinking about things, is we tend to invest meaning in things, right? Whether it's in statues of old Confederates or whether it's in I don't know, things we find on the internet. We tend to invest meaning, and we tend to think that there's a certain proper way to behave towards those things, and the anti-immigration sentiment is kind of a fear that people are going to come in and not value the same things that we value, and then that's going to have some kind of implication for social cohesion. But really it's a kind of egotistical, kind of selfish fear that, like, my meaning world, my life world, as Husserl would call it, my Lebenswelt is not going to I'm not going to be able to maintain that. I'm not going to be able to, I mean, I always love the psychological terms assimilation or accommodation, right? So when you encounter something that the structures of meaning that you already have in place are equipped to deal with, then all you're really doing is assimilating it to the structure that's already there. Whereas if something happens that's like way out of the ordinary, that you can't sort of deal with without some kind of dissociation, then you have to accommodate that by changing the sorts of meaning structures that you have in place. Like, it's a much more fundamental change when we're talking accommodation instead of assimilation. And I think some people fear that sort of idea that they're going to have to accommodate new ideas or accommodate new ways of being. So they don't like people moving into their community who are different than them. People tend to get that xenophobic outlook, which I really think can be solved if you really just encouraged people to learn and have new experiences, then they'd be less afraid of difference.
Yeah, this sounds like the hermeneutic circle that we kind of talked about with the Heidegger episode.
Yeah.
It seems like a narrow hermeneutic just leads to everything being a crisis, right? And I think if we have a hermeneutic cycle as a culture, it's trained by news media to interpret everything as a crisis. Every week is a crisis. Because if it weren't a crisis, then you wouldn't need to listen to them to tell you that it was a crisis. So I think if there's one thing that we could say about postmodernism, which I don't usually like to use that term, but it would be of a very thin or a very small, a very thin or a very small hermeneutic, where you are constantly defending the fragility of your smoky, spectral view of the world, and that's what's worth defending because it's the last thing you can hold on to.
Yeah, I put it a little bit different way and say that there are two kind of hermeneutics we could adopt. One is a masturbatory hermeneutic, where essentially what we need is for everyone else in the world to essentially emulate my fantasies and emulate the sources of meaning that I think are important, right? Otherwise, I'm unable to take enjoyment from the sources of signification that exist in the world, right? Or we can have an erotic hermeneutic that's fundamentally inclusionary, that takes joy and even excitement from the fact that we have to deal with the other in a constructive way that allows them to maintain their difference while at the same time producing something greater as a group that forms a relationship with one another than anyone can come up with individually. And I think, again, what you see characteristic of a lot of reactionaries is precisely that they are highly dependent on this masturbatory hermeneutic of existence, right? Where, they have to look into the world and see themselves reflected into it in every kind of feature of existence.
Well put.
All right. Well, before we wrap up an episode on crisis, news media. I mean, they're still probably talking about Trump, right? I have happily been away from the news, but there we got a big crisis.
He's allowed the transition, but he's still denying the results.
Really? Okay, so it's another fake crisis. But we'd be remiss if we didn't finish talking about Eric's thick source of meaning, the crisis of crises, climate. Positive feedback.
Oh yeah. Oh God. I know the crisis, the ecological crisis is something, but I didn't want to bash our conversation over the head with that.
No,
that's too easy.
I think we gotta at least finish with it, because what makes that different from every other, supposed urgent, radical rethinking required matter?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about it quite a lot, and it's difficult. It seems like it is a unique kind of crisis. It is a crisis among crises, because it has a definite material dimension that can't be dealt with. It can't be dealt with by addressing the same issues that postmodernism and post-structuralism have been addressing it through, which is almost a way like a radical rethinking, like that term we've been using. Like, can we just radically rethink ourselves, and the crisis will go away? I mean, in a sense. I mean, I'm tempted to be super inflammatory and just say, like, the liberal conception of the human being and the human relationship to the world has been at the heart of the climate crisis, or at least it's behind it, because we've always considered, like, maybe one of these major sources of meaning in our lives have always been that human beings are somehow special, and that the rest of the world is somehow less than human.
Preach.
Like, not even non-human, but just less than human, right? Like, humans are the only things that meaning is for, and only the things that can make meaning, right? But that is probably a pathology that's been in our heads for a long time, that's been contributing to where we are today, in the sense of, I mean, unlimited growth, and nature is a standing reserve, and capitalism, and those sorts of things have been contributing to this feedback loop where we're putting more carbon into the atmosphere than the world can deal with. And it seems to me to require a radical new approach, different from the other approaches that we've been using for other things like identity and immigration and refugee people, and a whole slew of other issues that are also close to us. The ecological crisis seems to be different, because, you say, incremental change, reform, deliberation, but we don't have time for any of that shit.
Yeah.
We get constant warnings by the IPCC and all those guys saying we don't have time. We just need to change. But we can't. We're addicted to fossil fuels. We love plastic. We love buying shit. All of this stuff is making this climate crisis something that's radically different from anything we've ever faced before. Like, we always think that, like, human beings live on a trajectory which is always into the future. We live in a progressive forward movement, and that nature is cyclical. It always restores. It always comes back. It's always in that backstop to, no matter how bad we fuck up our society, we can rely on nature being there like a safety net almost. Not in a way, because you can be in nature in abject poverty and it's not going to help you. But in another sense, if these ecological services that we've been relying on and not thinking about, not investing meaning in for so long go away, well, they're going to come back to bite us in a real bad fucking way that we better be ready for. And we're not ready for it. And all these other crises seem to me to pale in comparison to what people are going to be dealing with in that near the end, by the end of the 21st century, it seems. And that, it's alarmism. That's the conservative line. That's the neoliberal line. That's the line. It's all alarmism. But I have a feeling it's not, and I have a feeling that we need to really have a radical new approach.
I need to raise my own alarm, because actually, while we were talking, one of the most significant moments in modern left-wing history has occurred, because
Chomsky?
Jagmeet Singh and Alexandria
We're going to say
Ocasio-Cortez.
Chomsky's dead.
No. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Jagmeet Singh have just agreed to play Among Us on Twitch together tomorrow.
Oh, God.
And it's a pairing of the American left and the Canadian left that is virtually unprecedented, where we're now literally rocketing into space, baby.
Well, I can tell you what I'm doing tomorrow.
AOC is good. We need that Green New Deal. I hope she wins. Are they playing against each other? I don't know.
They are, yeah. I mean, the whole point of the game is, well, you cooperate, but one person is a serial killer. And
yeah, it's like Werewolf, Eric. I think I invited you to play once.
Yeah.
Anyway, back to Eric's story. The one thing that doesn't make sense to, whether you want to call a human and human society like narratological, like they depend on these meaning structures that take place through the position that you put yourself in the narrative. This thing's alien to us, even though it's probably the only real crisis that like the species will face, unless you want to count COVID. But you can't put yourself in a narrative that lasts so far beyond you and so far before you, unless you have a real collective sense of what humanity is. And I don't know whether it was different. I have no idea whether it was different before or whether it's like big bad liberal individualism that made us only think in terms of what you can get out of something. But I don't think we have the narrative resources, despite making all these Hollywood films about collapse and crisis and what it's going to look like after that. I don't think we have the hermeneutic, I'll say. We don't have the broadness of a hermeneutic required to even understand what's happening enough to ever make anything happen. And I hope someday, long into the future, some cave-dwelling, the road guy with a shotgun digs a hard drive out.
It's a dark movie.
And someone recorded the Plastic Pills podcast talking about this, and he goes, I wish someone would have listened to them.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many patterns of thinking, even in the most well-meaning and egalitarian liberal humanism, that is not prepared to deal with the climate issues that we're going to be facing in the 21st century. It's just not. It's just not. Like, even going back to Donna Haraway, she points out that if you take out everything in your body that is not human, there's probably going to be about 4 pounds of stuff left over. Like, we rely not only on the microbiomes and the other kinds of things that are crawling around our skin all the time, but we're also like not as human as we thought we were, because we rely on these ecosystem services and we're embedded in an ecology. And that's why, like, I try to focus on ecological thinking a little more, because I think this sort of liberal individualism has been, like, it's run its course, it's served its purpose. We've got people who are aware of civil rights, people who are aware of the importance of individual freedom and living in a free society, but that's not enough. Like, we need a new way of thinking of ourselves as embedded in different kinds of systems, not only social, but material and organic systems that we rely on. Like,
so I would say we don't need it to be a radical rethinking. We just need to, following, I think, what Matt's opinion, I'm going to assume is, which is like, we need to preserve those things that we like about liberal individualism, but like enhance them with these other ways. So it's an enhancement of because I don't think we want to throw those things away.
No, we want to build on them. But what I'm saying is in a way they're not enough.
I would actually
I agree.
Build upon that by saying that one of the problems that face us in this environmental situation is the notion that nature has an independent teleology to it, a kind of meaning that's implicit and goes beyond the human. And the kind of rhetorics and theologies that are associated with this is the notion that nature is self-correcting, right? There's nothing that we can do that's so bad that it can't revert back to the way it was before, because nature has some kind of implicit significance to it that human beings can't interfere with, right? And I think precisely by recognizing nature and human beings as artificial creations, we can understand why it is that everything that is produced is fragile, right? Including the natural environment, right? We can't just assume that existence is going to autocorrect for anything that we do to it.
Well, I mean, the language of conservation and preservation that was brought up earlier is a nice start, but we've been doing that for a long time, and it hasn't been working. I mean, we're on a decline, right? Species are going extinct faster than they're coming into being. We're losing the biodiversity of the planet, and that's going to have major impacts on our health and our psychological well-being going into the future. I mean, there's just so many different ways we need to get in. Like, I can't even do it in the last section of this crisis video. And that's why I just wanted to focus on more human-centered crises than focusing on an ecological crisis. Because those questions are going to bring us to the brink of our humanity and beyond. And we're probably not ready to go there at this late an hour in the day in our episode here. But I think yeah, it's not like incremental change, the language of preservation, the language of changing our ways. Like, we're already fucked. It's not a matter of preserving what's left. It's just a matter of damage control at this point. Like, we're already fucked. And the longer we take to realize that, and the longer we start to think, the longer we keep thinking that, like, oh, neoliberalism and free market thinking and being able to spend your money any way you want is still okay because that's the part of the liberal tradition and that's okay. The longer we keep thinking that, and the longer fossil fuels are allowed to continue to do what they're doing and influence politics, and I'm seeing Biden loading his cabinet with lobbyists and fossil fuel people and all that shit, like, the longer we let this go, the harder it's going to be to address in the future. And liberal humanism is not going to cut it. We need a liberal post-humanism at least.
Ooh, shots fired.
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe I was just going to quickly add, maybe COVID helped a little bit with the ecological crisis. We'll see.
We need to knock a few bodies off the planet.
Yeah, I mean, it showed us what's possible, and Bruno Latour pointed this out. It showed us what's possible because we all said before, we can't just stop things, right? We can't just stop because the economy will collapse. Our supply chains will collapse. And COVID's showed us that, yes, we can stop this shit. And yes, nature will respond in positive ways, although we shouldn't be too optimistic about seeing dolphins near Venice or whatever was happening whatever those news stories that were popping up near the beginning.
Yeah.
We shouldn't put too much stock in those things because those aren't, those are news stories. Again, those are media creations. But it does show us that things are possible that we've been convinced are not possible. We've been shown that things can change that, the so-called elites want to convince us that can't be changed. Yeah, nature's telos is our telos, and the nature culture, nature society divide is a creation of modern man that is totally maladaptive and fucked, and we need to get rid of it ASAP. So everybody think about nature.
The last thing I wanted to leave you with is, do you ever do the math and figure out when you're going to die? Like if it comes at the average age versus early?
Yeah, about 2070 I'm cashing in.
I'm looking at based on our lifestyles, I think we're probably dead in the 2060s.
Yeah, that's probably a reasonable
unless
guess.
There was an accident. But then the thing is, if we have a kid, that kid's gonna make it to 2090, and who knows what the hell happens then. So every time Eric teaches me about these thresholds that we cross.
Yeah, keep an eye on that Siberian methane.
Not that it's up to me, by the way. I was just considering this thought would never have crossed anybody's mind even 50 years ago, right?
No, it's true. Think about the next generation. That's a good way to put it as well. It's yeah. Even if you're not going to have kids, think about other people's kids.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, crisis. I think we'll just call this crisis: a radical rethinking. And maybe we can misspell crisis, put some brackets or a slash in there somewhere to make it we're playing on words.
Use a tasteful Z. That always helps.
Oh, that was really 90s though. I don't think that's cool anymore.
Crises. No, that's true.
Yeah. Crisis in culture. Something like that. The crisis of crisis.
Anyway, guys, it was a great discussion. I don't want to call this an unstructured episode because that just sounds like we're lazy, because we did do some preparation. So I think we'll call it, these are a free form episodes where we don't have to...
An emergent structure.
Yeah, we don't have to do a whole bunch of research and reading beforehand. It's more like, what do you think about crisis?
Exactly. What can PhDs or soon to be PhDs think about or like come up with on the spot?
What we've already read contribute.
Yeah.
Hopefully it wasn't all for nothing. I forget a lot of things, but
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
I hope
like
it was
this.
fun for the
All right, cool.
listeners.
I'm gonna stop.
Anyway, we're gonna shut down the recording. Thanks, Eric, Matt, and Victor. We got a few episodes
Thanks
left
for
before
listening,
a
guys.
little bit of a Christmas break, but I'll see you guys all next week.
see you next time, folks.
That's it.
Yep.